Okay, so here is a wild idea. What if you planted something once, just once, and it just kept feeding you? Spring, summer, fall, into winter, no replanting, no starting over every few months like normal. Sounds unreal, right? Like something a seed catalogue would print in bold letters to get you to buy more seeds. It is not made up. There are 12 plants that genuinely do this. Real plants growing in real backyards right now. And most people have never grown a single one of them on purpose. Some of them people actually pull out and throw away without knowing what they had. You plant them once, you step back, and they just keep working, quietly handing you food across almost the entire calendar instead of one frantic month and then nothing. No greenhouse, no fancy setup. Just knowing which 12 plants actually pull this off. That is what I'm revealing to you today. And I think by the end of it, you are going to want to tear out half of what is currently in your garden and start over. Let us get into it. Quick thing first, because I want to know. Drop a comment telling me the longest stretch you have ever gone without buying a single vegetable from a store thanks to your own garden. A week? A month? Longer? I am genuinely curious how close people have gotten to this, and it tells me exactly how deep to go on this topic next. Here is the honest catch before we start, because I am not going to sell you a fantasy. Almost all year does not mean every single plant fruiting in a blizzard with zero help from you. Some of these are perennial, meaning you plant once and they come back reliably for years, stretching your effort across decades instead of seasons. Some are cut and come again, meaning one planting keeps handing you leaves for months on end instead of one single harvest. A few need a pot you can bring indoors, or a simple cold frame to push through the hardest weeks of winter. That is not cheating. That is exactly how serious growers keep food coming when everyone else's garden has gone dead and brown. Now let us get into the 12. Number 1, kale, and it earns the top spot for a reason. Kale shrugs off frost that would kill most vegetables outright, and cold does not just fail to hurt it, cold actually improves it, converting stored starches into sugar so the leaves taste sweeter after a freeze than they did in warm weather. Most vegetables treat frost as an execution order. Kale treats it as a flavour upgrade. Cut the outer leaves and the plant keeps pushing new growth from the centre, so one planting in spring can keep feeding you clear through fall, and in many climates straight through winter under nothing more than a simple frost cover, sometimes with no cover at all if you live somewhere the ground rarely freezes solid. It is the single longest running vegetable most gardeners will ever grow, and most people pull it in October out of habit, right when it is entering its best stretch. Leave it standing through a killing frost or two before you judge it done, and you will watch a plant that looked finished in September quietly outproduce everything else in the bed straight through the darkest, coldest months of the year. Number 2, Swiss Chard, kale's cousin in staying power, and in my opinion, criminally underused. Chard tolerates heat that would send lettuce bolting bitter within days, and it tolerates cold that would flatten basil overnight, which is a combination almost nothing else on a vegetable list can claim. One plant comfortable at both ends of the thermometer. Harvest the outer stalks and leave the growing centre untouched, and a single chard plant will keep handing you fresh greens from spring planting straight through a hard frost, sometimes longer with a bit of cover, without ever needing to be replanted mid-season. One row of chard cut correctly instead of pulled whole will outproduce 3 separate plantings of anything that only gives you one harvest and quits, because you are essentially harvesting the same plant a dozen times over instead of harvesting a dozen plants once each. The colour alone, those deep red and gold stems, makes it one of the few vegetables that is doing double duty as both dinner and decoration in the bed all season long. Number 3, and this is where perennial herbs earn their spot, rosemary. In a mild climate, rosemary stays green and harvestable straight through winter, a woody evergreen shrub that is quietly cooking dinner with you in every single month of the year, without ever going dormant or dying back, standing there fragrant and productive even in January when most of the garden is a memory. In a colder climate, one pot on a sunny windowsill does the same job, moving indoors before the first hard freeze and moving back out once the danger has passed each spring. And either way, you plant it exactly once and harvest from the same plant for years, sometimes decades, while everything else in the garden gets ripped out and replanted from scratch every single spring without fail. Established rosemary also gets tougher, woodier, and more productive with age rather than weaker or worn out. So the small, unimpressive looking plant you put in this year is genuinely an investment that keeps paying larger and larger dividends the longer you simply leave it alone and let it mature. Number 4, thyme, sage, and oregano round out the perennial herb bench. And I am grouping them together because they share the exact same underlying trick that makes rosemary work. Low growing, woody at the base, and often still green and pinchable under a light dusting of snow in a climate that would kill a tender annual dead by October without a second thought. A single established clump of any of these three will outlast most vegetables in your garden by years, needs almost no attention beyond an occasional trim to keep it tidy, and gives you real, usable, full flavour in the dead of winter when your grocery store's fresh herb section is charging triple what the exact same handful cost you back in the middle of July. Plant one small clump of each along a sunny edge of your yard exactly once, give it a season or two to establish, and you have effectively installed a permanent spice rack that restocks itself every single year for free, with no seed packet, no store trip, and no planning required ever again. Number 5, chives, one of the very first things to push up green in early spring, often weeks before anything else in the garden even stirs, and one of the last things still standing in late fall after a string of hard frosts has already taken out everything annual around it. Chives are perennial, so the exact same clump comes back thicker and stronger every single year without you lifting a finger to replant it, spreading slowly into a bigger, more productive patch season after season. A pot on a windowsill will keep handing you fresh green onion flavour through the coldest months if you simply bring it indoors before the ground freezes solid. Plant it once at the edge of a bed, largely forget about it, and it will quietly outseason nearly everything you deliberately planted to replace it, showing up early, staying late, and asking for almost nothing in between. Let me pause here for a second, because building a garden that feeds you nearly year round is exactly what this channel is about. No sponsors, nothing pushed on you, just what genuinely extends a harvest. If that is useful, following along means you catch the next one when it drops. No pressure. Back to the list, because the back half gets even more interesting. And a couple of these are going to completely change how you think about plants you already have growing somewhere in your yard right now. Number 6, arugula. The fastest mover on this entire list and one of the most underrated vegetables a person can grow. Mostly because it gets treated as a garnish for a salad rather than a serious crop in its own right. It germinates and grows so quickly, often ready to harvest in 3 to 4 weeks from seed, that you can sow a fresh patch every couple of weeks and never once run dry waiting on the next batch to catch up. Staggering plantings the way a smart baker staggers loaves instead of baking everything the same morning. It tolerates cold shockingly well for such a fast, tender feeling green, often surviving a light frost that would end lettuce for the season outright, and it keeps growing in weather that has most tender greens already given up and gone dormant for the winter. Heat is its one real weakness. It bolts and turns sharp and genuinely bitter in a hard summer stretch, developing a peppery intensity that goes from pleasant to overwhelming almost overnight once temperatures climb. So do not fight that tendency, work with it instead, and simply skip sowing it during the hottest month or two. Grown in the cool shoulders of spring and fall and pushed a little further into winter under a simple cover, arugula can realistically be on your plate 10 months out of 12 with almost no effort beyond a packet of seeds sown on repeat and a little seasonal discipline about when to hold off. Number 7, parsley, a plant most people treat as a garnish and completely underestimate as a serious producer. Parsley is biennial, meaning it lives a full 2 years instead of just one, and it tolerates real, genuine cold, often standing green under a light dusting of snow, when everything annual around it has already collapsed into mush. Sow it once in spring, harvest the outer stems all summer long without ever killing the plant, since new growth keeps rising from the centre exactly like kale and chard, and it will often carry straight through winter into a second spring, at which point it finally goes to seed and its useful life winds down. But by then, it has already given you nearly a full year and then some of continuous harvest from one single planting, which makes the humble garnish one of the quiet overachievers on this entire list. Number 8. Mint. And I need to give this one a real warning right alongside the praise, because mint is aggressive to the point of taking over an entire bed within a single season if you plant it directly in open ground, spreading by underground runners that ignore borders, edging, and good intentions alike. Grow it contained in a pot, and that same aggression becomes an asset instead of a problem you regret for years. A potted mint plant dies back to the roots in a hard freeze outdoors, but comes back reliably every spring from that same root system, often more vigorous than the year before. And brought indoors to a sunny window, it will keep producing fresh leaves straight through winter when the outdoor version is sitting dormant. Contained and rotated indoors and out with the seasons, mint becomes one of the most reliable near year-round herbs you can grow, producing far more than most households can even use, as long as you never let its roots touch open soil. Number 9. Asparagus. The patience play on this entire list and worth including for exactly that reason, even though it behaves differently from everything else here. Plant it once and it will keep coming back and producing spears every single spring for 15 to 20 years, sometimes considerably longer, from the same root crowns without ever needing to be dug up and replanted, which is a return on a single afternoon of digging a trench that almost nothing else in gardening can match. Thoughtful. The harvest window itself runs a matter of weeks each spring rather than months, so I want to be straight with you. This is not a daily harvest all year long. It is a plant you invest patience in once, and that then quietly feeds you every single spring for 2 full decades, while you do almost nothing but wait, weed lightly around it through the summer, and let the tall, ferny tops grow undisturbed after harvest ends, so they can feed energy back down into the roots for next year's spears. The first 2 years after planting you cannot harvest at all, which tests a lot of people's patience right out of the gate, but every year after that the bed only gets more productive, never less, for decades. Stack it alongside the fast movers on this list and it becomes one strong thread woven into a much longer tapestry, instead of trying to carry the whole calendar on its own. Number 10. Rhubarb, asparagus' cousin in the patience department, another true perennial that returns reliably every year once established, often producing for a decade or more from the exact same crown with almost no replanting ever required. One important warning here, and I mean this seriously, only the stalks are edible. The leaves contain oxalic acid at levels that make them genuinely unsafe to eat. So harvest the stalks and always discard the leaves. No exceptions, no experimenting. Handled correctly, rhubarb gives you a real satisfying harvest window each spring into early summer, returning stronger and more productive year after year for a plant you only ever have to put in the ground exactly once. Number 11. Ever-bearing strawberries, and the word ever-bearing is doing real work in that name, because unlike the classic June-bearing type that dumps its entire crop into one intense couple of weeks and then quits completely for the year, going fully dormant with nothing to show for the rest of the season, ever-bearing varieties trickle out smaller flushes of berries repeatedly from late spring all the way into fall, with modest lulls in between rather than one single cliff followed by silence. You trade the single overwhelming harvest, the kind that buries you in berries for 2 weeks and then vanishes and leaves you with nothing until next June, for a long steady drip of fresh fruit spread across most of the growing season instead, which suits an ordinary household's actual eating habits far better than one giant glut you cannot possibly work through before it spoils. And as a perennial, the same plants keep doing this again the following year without being dug up and replanted, sending out new runners that expand your patch for free while they are at it. So a small initial planting quietly grows into a larger one on its own over a few seasons. Number 12, sweet potatoes. And this one earns its spot by quietly giving you 2 entirely separate harvests from a single plant instead of just one, which is rare enough on its own to deserve the closing slot on this list. The vines produce edible leafy greens you can cut and eat continuously all summer long without harming the plant's growth underground at all. A genuine cut and come again vegetable hiding in plain sight right on top of the soil, while most people only ever picture the orange tuber underneath and never think to touch the leaves. Then in fall, once the vines have done their work all season building up energy below ground, you dig up the actual sweet potatoes themselves, which cure for a couple of weeks, and then store for months afterward in a cool, dry spot, stretching that single spring planting's food value all the way from fresh summer greens through an entire winter's worth of stored, ready-to-cook roots sitting quietly in your pantry. Few plants on this list, or arguably anywhere else in a home garden, give you that much total food from one seasonal investment of time and a single planting. So there are your 12. And here is the real thread connecting every single one of them, because that thread is the actual lesson buried underneath the list. Nearly year-round food is not really about finding some rare miracle plant that ignores winter entirely and fruits through a blizzard on its own. It comes from deliberately stacking a few different strategies on top of each other until the gaps close. Cold, hardy vegetables like kale, chard, and arugula that keep going long after summer plants have already collapsed into frozen mush. Perennial herbs and plants like rosemary, thyme, chives, asparagus, and rhubarb that you plant exactly once and then harvest from for years, sometimes decades, without ever replanting them from scratch. Cut and come again, growers like chard, parsley, and sweet potato greens that keep handing you fresh food from one single planting instead of a single harvest, and done. And a couple of container tricks like potted mint and rosemary you bring indoors before the first hard freeze that push your personal growing season straight through the months that would otherwise shut you out of fresh food completely. Stack even 4 or 5 of these together in the same garden, layered deliberately instead of scattered at random, and you have built yourself a genuinely long harvest calendar, not from one impossible plant that does it all, but from smart, overlapping timing that most gardens simply never bother to plan for. Now, some honesty about the limits, because I would rather you know this going in than feel let down later after you have already planted everything. Your actual results depend heavily on your climate and your specific growing zone, and someone gardening in a mild coastal climate is going to get considerably closer to a literal 12 months of harvest than someone dealing with a hard, deep freeze winter that locks the ground solid for months, and that gap is simply geography, not a flaw in any of these plants themselves or in you as a gardener. A few of these, especially the tender herbs, genuinely do better with a little help through the coldest stretch of the year, a cold frame, a simple row cover pulled over the bed on the worst nights, or just moving a pot indoors before the first hard freeze, rather than being left completely exposed outdoors and expected to perform miracles on their own. And none of these replace a full balanced diet by themselves. They dramatically extend your fresh food calendar and cut down how much you are buying at certain times of year. They do not make a grocery store trip obsolete entirely. Set your expectations there at extension rather than total replacement, and every single one of these will genuinely surprise you with how far it actually stretches once you give it a real chance. Here is the bonus most people do not expect once they actually build this out, and it took me a full season to notice it myself. A garden with staggered, overlapping harvests like this is also a garden that produces dramatically less waste and less panic. You are not stuck eating the same overwhelming glut of one single vegetable for 2 straight weeks and then scrambling once it is suddenly gone, the way a garden planted all at once in a single burst tends to behave. Instead, you get a steady, manageable trickle spread across most of the year. A handful of chard leaves here, a few chive stems there, a bowl of berries every few days instead of all at once, which is both easier to actually use up in the kitchen before it spoils and, frankly, far more satisfying to walk outside and harvest from on an ordinary Tuesday. It turns gardening from a frantic seasonal event, everything ready at once, everything gone a month later, into a quiet, ongoing relationship with your own backyard that you can step into almost any week of the year. There is also a resilience bonus worth naming. When one crop has a rough year, a late frost sets back your greens, a hot spell stresses your berries, having 11 other things on staggered schedules means your whole food supply is not riding on a single plant's good luck. If you want to actually put this into practice rather than just admire the list, here is the simplest way to start without overwhelming yourself. Do not try to plant all 12 at once this season. That is a fast track to neglecting half of them. Pick 3, 1 perennial herb, 1 cold hardy leafy green, and 1 long season producer like ever-bearing strawberries or sweet potato, and get those 3 genuinely established and thriving before adding more. A perennial herb and a cut and come again green together will already stretch your harvest further than most gardens manage with 20 different plants scattered everywhere at random. Once those 3 are humming along and you understand how they behave in your specific yard, your specific soil, your specific pocket of sun and shade, add another 2 or 3 the following season. Within 2 or 3 years of building layer by layer like this, rather than trying to install the whole system in one overwhelming weekend, you end up with exactly the kind of nearly year-round garden this whole video has been describing, built at a pace you can actually sustain instead of one you burn out on by August. Let me tell you how this played out for me, because it is the whole reason I trust this list instead of just repeating what I read somewhere. I used to have a garden that peaked hard in July, buried me in tomatoes and squash for about 6 weeks, and then went essentially silent by October, and every single winter I was back to buying everything fresh at the store, like I had never grown a thing in my life, month after month, feeling a little embarrassed every time I walked past my own dead brown garden bed on the way to my car. The year I deliberately planted kale and chard alongside my usual summer crops instead of as an afterthought, and put rosemary and chives in as permanent fixtures instead of something I bought fresh and used up, everything changed. That October, instead of pulling everything and calling the season officially over the way I always had, I was still walking out for chard and kale, and by December, under nothing more than an old row cover I genuinely just had lying around in the garage from a project years earlier, I was still cutting kale leaves in weather that had frost on the ground every single morning without exception. The following spring, chives and asparagus were up and quietly producing before I had even started my seed trays for the summer crops, weeks ahead of schedule, feeding me before the real gardening season had technically even begun. My grocery bill for fresh greens dropped noticeably across the entire winter, not because I stopped needing greens or ate less of them, but because my own backyard was quietly still supplying them the whole time, and I had simply stopped noticing how much I used to pay for something I could grow myself for pennies. And the cost side of that is worth saying plainly, because the numbers genuinely surprised me when I actually added them up at the end of that first year. A packet of kale seeds, a packet of chard seeds, 1 small rosemary plant, and a single chive division cost me under $15 total, all in that first spring, and the rosemary and chives are still producing years later from that exact same original planting, at 0 additional cost beyond a little water and the occasional trim. Compare that $15 spent once to a full winter of buying bagged greens and small plastic packets of fresh herbs at grocery store prices every single week for months on end, and the math simply is not close. It is not even a fair fight. A tiny, one-time investment, smaller than a single week's grocery run, turned into years of quiet, ongoing food that I now genuinely take for granted, which is exactly the point. If this changed how you think about what your garden could be doing for you across the calendar instead of just the summer, that is exactly what this channel exists for. So go ahead and subscribe and turn on notifications, because the next video walks through exactly how to layer these 12 plantings together into an actual month-by-month calendar for your specific growing zone, so you are not left guessing at timing on your own. And before you go, do that thing I asked at the very start. If you have not already, drop a comment and tell me which of these 12 you are most excited to try, or if you are already growing one of them, tell me how far into the year it has genuinely carried you. Because I read every single comment that comes in, and it shapes exactly what I build next, right down to which plant gets its own deep dive. I will see you there.